Good afternoon and welcome. My name is John Horning and I'm the Executive Director of WildEarth Guardians. Thank you for joining us for this edition of WildEarth Webinars. We have Guardian supporters from all over the country, although I'm noting that today's participants are coming primarily from the Rocky Mountain West. We've got people from Wyoming, Nevada, Montana, Colorado, and of course, New Mexico, where I am. And I want to offer a special welcome to some longtime Guardians members, Ann Harvey, Luana Rubin, and Ed Oppenheimer, who all three of you are joining us from various states across the West. I love doing these WildEarth webinars. It's especially valuable given that we're all continuing to deal with this global pandemic that has us both feeling and really experiencing isolation. And so it's nice to be able to connect. In these WildEarth webinars, we like to bring together national issue experts, people from frontline communities, oftentimes even elected officials, and WildEarth Guardian staff to talk about critical issues at a critical time. Our purpose is always to inform, inspire, and activate Guardians like you to help us confront powerful extractive industries, to demand greater leadership from our elected officials. And it's all about solving the nature and climate crises and creating the kind of world we want. We also want to answer your questions. So know that I'll take one about halfway through and others at the end. We always reserve 5 to 10 minutes at the end for your questions. Like to make this conversation as participatory as possible. Today we'll be talking about the ongoing threats from all kinds of threats related to extractive industries and extremist hate groups in the American West that are threatening our public lands and the people whose job it is to protect and manage public lands. So with that in mind, I've invited Gloria Floria, who is a former forest supervisor of the Lewis and Clark National Forest in Montana. She was targeted by extremist groups in part for her decision to ban oil and gas leasing on the Rocky Mountain front in Montana. In fact, Gloria resigned from the Forest Service to call political and national attention to the dangers of domestic terrorists targeting federal lands and the employees who are responsible for managing them. Also joining me is Richard Spotts. Richard is a former Bureau of Land Management employee who likewise has been the subject of threats and intimidation for doing his job as a planning and environmental coordinator for the BLM. Welcome to you both. It's good to have you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I wanted to start with this question. You both had long careers, though perhaps not long as you would have hoped. I actually don't know that. As employees of federal land management agencies, as a way of introducing yourselves, could you each briefly explain what drew you to want to serve in this role? And why don't you start, Gloria?
Unmute button and make it function. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to come and speak with you. How I got involved in the career in public land management? Pretty straightforward. I love the forests. Grew up in western Pennsylvania, but saw the Rocky Mountains for the first time when I was 16, and was immediately convinced I'd been born in the wrong place, that I was actually a Westerner who, by some error, was born in Pennsylvania. So I, as soon as possible, as soon as I graduated from college, I moved to the West and And I think that a pivotal moment in my life was when I was in high school. I was visiting my brother who had lived in an extremely rural area in Northern California, and a lot of logging trucks used to go by the area, and I saw one log loads, and that is one piece of a tree that was so large it filled up an entire logging truck, and it was just a piece of it. And I fell to my knees and said, never again, not if I can help it. So the Forest Service was a great place for me to end up.
Mhm. Thank you, Gloria. How about you, Richard? How'd you get to the BLM?
Well, for me, it was kind of a circuitous route. I grew up in Southern California in the 1950s and 60s. And when I was 15, I volunteered at an Audubon Nature Center and started to really care about nature and wildlife and bird watching. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, I fell in love with BLM lands, primarily in the Mojave Desert in Southern California. But as I was falling in love with those desert lands, I saw hordes of sheep basically vacuuming up all the spring flowers and grasses and forage that the desert tortoises need when they came out of their burrows in the spring from brumation, and saw the beginning of the proliferation of motorcycles and ATVs, and how that fundamentally changed a lot of the Mojave in terms of just endless braiding spaghetti-like road networks. So I both fell in love and was really appalled by seeing the incapacity of the agencies to protect these public lands from those kinds of obvious threats.
You know what I love about the two of you and what we have in terms of the panel is you bring both different agency perspectives, different, your story, Gloria, of being attracted and outraged both to forests and seeing what had happened to forests, and then your story, Richard, kind of more of a desert rat and being outraged by what was happening to desert ecosystems. So we've got diverse agency perspectives and diverse personal and kind of origin stories in terms of what brings you both or brought you both to federal land management agencies. The way that I'm going to structure this conversation is really to sort of have both Richard and Gloria talk about their personal context and diagnose the problem of extremist groups and the links between resource extraction, public lands, and extremism. And then we're going to talk about solutions. But we're going to spend the first 15 minutes or so understanding their view on the problem and diagnosing the problem from sort of on the ground level to the 30,000 foot level. And as a way of doing that, I wanted to start by hearing from each of you from the personal perspective. You've both had personal experience with threats of varying degrees and kinds. And I'd like for you to start, Gloria. Can you describe what that was like while also providing some historical conflict, some historical context for the conflict that was the catalyst for the threat? So Gloria, and then you, Richard.
Thank you, John. Actually, that's about a 4-hour answer, at least, when you get into a historical context. You know, besides being forest supervisor on the Lewis and Clark National Forest and making the decision to prohibit oil and gas leasing, or at least put a moratorium, which was the best I could do with my authority, on oil and gas leasing on the front, I was also the supervisor of the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest, which covers all the national forest lands in Nevada and about 800,000 acres in the Sierra Nevadas in California. And that was a real hotbed of extremist activity. Actually, I didn't feel quite as threatened in Montana as I did in Nevada. In Montana, there was a lot of public support for what for that decision, and for protection of the environment. So I had a lot of citizens who were watching my back, and also a number of elected officials who agreed with my decision and were watching out for me. So even though I was threatened, I still felt a little bit more protected. In Nevada, it was quite the opposite, because the few people in rural Nevada, and rural Nevada is quite a bit different from the populated zone on the western edge. There was a great deal of fear among citizens, as well as the participation by elected officials in the persecution of federal employees. So it was a very different scenario. And, it goes back to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and various times throughout Western history when certain people, I truly think that certain people believe that they have an axe to grind, and so they begin a very long story, a very deep story about who's to blame and how it came about and what the appropriate response is. And, peppered with a few real stories and then embellished with some beliefs and fears, it becomes quite out of control. We saw it in the 1970s with the Sagebrush Rebels, and, in and out, but escalating each time these issues and groups reappear. So, I want to give a short answer, but this is the best I can do, keeping it fairly short here.
Sure. Sure.
What I experienced personally, threats against my life and all that, and it's, I could get into all the gory details, but there were threats against my employees that had me much more concerned, because myself, I felt like I could do something about it. My employees, much more difficult.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. It was my understanding that the Montana action, by virtue of its boldness and visibility, was the action that resulted in more backlash and intimidation. It sounds like there's sort of a cultural context in the state of Nevada, which created an even greater sense of sort of fear. Is that so? And could you just speak to that for half a minute?
Sure, very definitely. When you have elected officials who are egging these people on, and you have people who are not held in check by the rest of their minion in their community, and in fact egged on, it really ramps up. I mean, think of the schoolyard. Some bully starts to push people around, and if the teachers support the bully, then the victims are really in trouble. And then you have other people egging them on. Oh yeah, go ahead, I dare you, I dare you. That's what it was like in Nevada. As I said in my letter of resignation, I did not retire, by the way, I resigned. My letter of resignation was, I called, Fed bashing is a spectator sport in Nevada. People like it. They think it's fun. They think, beat up on the feds. Ha ha, look at that, David and Goliath. It speaks to all kinds of cultural mythologies.
Yep, that's really helpful. Richard, why don't you weigh in, just again, personal perspective on the issue of harassment and intimidation, and your personal professional experience of it, to give the audience some granular sense of what that's like.
Thanks, John. I guess from my perspective, much of the stress during my 15 years at the Bureau of Land Management on the Arizona Strip dealt with trespass grazing. And from my perspective, I was dealing with both external threats from supporters of like Cliven Bundy, but I was also dealing with equally or more stressful threats internally from management. Not to document some of the problems from the trespass grazing, not to put anything in writing that might be embarrassing, I had a county, very, very powerful Republican county commissioner come after my job because I had the audacity to write a letter to the editor in the local newspaper as a private citizen expressing concerns. And part of the BLM culture is that if you work for BLM, you forfeit your First Amendment rights to free speech and association, which is not true, which is illegal and unconstitutional, but that's still how the management feels, that if you work for BLM, keep your head down, don't make eye contact, shut up, and basically do what you're supposed to do, but don't question authority, never document anything potentially illegal or embarrassing. And the irony for me, I was hired as the environmental coordinator for a district that covers all the BLM land north and west of the Colorado River in the state of Arizona. Arizona's Strip District is still largely a rural cultural type office in terms of that contrast that Gloria discussed between Nevada and Montana. So even though St. George proper here is a rapidly growing area, again, the cultural features were pretty rural. And there was a lot of sympathy for Cliven Bundy and a lot of very privileged white, I will say, Republican men that basically think they can do whatever they want, kind of the cowboy mythology. And a lot of BLM managers who are too afraid to challenge that, even if it means not doing their jobs in the public interest in terms of upholding the law and applying the best science to management decisions. So again, it was frustrating to get physical threats on the phone and at one meeting by Bundy supporters and have law enforcement tell me, hey, maybe you should park your car back with the fire trucks when you come to work. Maybe you should keep your phone out whenever you leave the building to call 911 if somebody's approaching you with a baseball bat or whatever. So I learned that basically law enforcement couldn't protect me as a federal employee. And that the managers, as Gloria said, if anything, by their lack of action, at least implicit support, were egging on the people that were making the threats. So it was a totally dysfunctional situation.
Yeah. Speaking to the deeper dimensions of this problem, the dysfunction, and you've also talked, Richard, about culture rot within the BLM. I want to connect some dots here. And the reason I want to do this is because, as both of you know, and maybe many of the members of the audience listening in know, 3 weeks ago, we also talked about this issue from a different perspective, but tied it very much to the insurrection at the nation's capital and how the West is an incubating ground for insurrection. And as a result of that, we've had a few members say, I don't see it. These are members, I don't see the connection between Guardian's work and why you're talking about these issues related to, you touched on this, Richard, white nationalism, patriarchy, white privilege, and violence and insurrection. Can both of you really at a basic level speak to why this matters? You've touched on it, but how do these problems of violence and intimidation relate to endangered species and protecting wildlife and enforcing environmental laws that protect the natural world? And why don't you go first, Richard, and then Gloria?
Okay. Well, I know that Wild Earth Guardians and its members and activists care a lot about upholding laws like the Endangered Species Act, Federal Land Policy Management Act, Land and Water Conservation Law, Antiquities Act. Well, let me just give you the example of the Cliven Bundy chronic trespass grazing in the Gold Butte area of Clark County, Nevada, that extends into parts of Arizona and Utah, very widespread. There's a large area that since about 1995, up to and including the present, has had increasing numbers of trespass cows in violation of Endangered Species Act biological opinions, that grazing in that area was to be phased out, ranchers were to be compensated for relinquishing their permits because of critical habitat for the Mojave Desert tortoise and also a plant species in the area. And basically, so the Endangered Species Act and the biological opinions for the BLM decisions for the area are totally ignored because BLM can't stop the chronic trespass grazing. And it's not only the cows grazing, it's the range improvements, putting in pipelines, troughs, various kinds of water facilities. Again, without clearing the area for tortoise burrows, without clearing the area for historical artifacts, violating Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. At the end of the Obama administration, hey, use the Antiquities Act, create a new BLM National Monument, Gold Butte. But you have all this chronic trespass grazing there. There were huge areas where BLM employees were told, you may not go into this area to monitor grazing, check utilization levels, check key areas for rangeland health, do NEPA inventories for various things. Basically became a no man's land. So if you care about the integrity of all these laws that people fight to uphold, and we're so worried that the Trump administration was weakening, what's the point of having all these laws on paper if the reality out on the ground in a huge area that could be a small European country basically becomes the sovereign land of Bundy, and law enforcement and BLM management is told basically don't go there. I mean, and so it's outrageous that people can't maybe make this obvious connection that laws are worthless if they're just words on paper. If managers aren't diligently implementing the laws, what's the point? What's the point?
Yeah. Gloria, what's your perspective on how threats, intimidation, harassment are critical, confronting them and addressing them in all kinds of different ways is critical to protecting wildlife and public lands for all?
Thank you, John. I certainly agree with Richard's comments and saw it in the Forest Service, not quite to that degree that there was actually, demarcated no-go zones, but not too much different. And I can certainly attest to his observations of differential application of the law. I saw it in Nevada. In one county in Nevada, BLM had, and the Forest Service had different requirements for bull trout habitat protection because they were weakened and lesser than science suggested, but they were done so because I was told that was what we thought politically we could get by with. It had nothing to do with bull trout. It had just had everything to do with intimidation. So, and I don't wish to be rude, but who do people think are out there on the ground trying to enforce the laws that are on the books? It's Federal Land Management Agency employees. That's the front line. And we don't have, and I'm using a current pronoun because I still, to a certain extent, affiliate myself with the Forest Service. Now, I was with them for 23 years, and I saw, along with the bad actors and the resource extraction, folks who prioritize resource extraction, there were those, but there were also really, really good, dedicated people who really worked very, very hard trying to make those laws real on the ground, trying to make the results, the outcomes, not just enforce regulations for the sake of enforcing a regulation, but using those regulations as a tool to ensure greater and better ecosystem integrity. So these are the frontline workers. Now, when they're getting chased, when they're getting ambushed, when they come back to their vehicle in the field, when women employees in the field are threatened with rape, when they're threatened to have their homes burned down. It makes an impact. You're out there, as I'm fond of saying, we were out there trying to protect Bambi, and we're getting death threats. Our children are getting death threats. We're being castigated in churches, in grocery stores, thrown out of motels, tracked. When I went to certain towns in Nevada, I would sprinkle flour all around my car before I went to bed at night, or if I was going to be in a long meeting, because then I could see if anybody approached my car, possibly planting a bomb on it. All I'm trying to do is protect Bambi. What's going on here? So this idea that we can somehow neatly segregate, our happy talk about protecting wildlife and protecting the forest, well, you don't do that without people. And you don't do it without people who are dedicated and people who are willing to do that in the face of threats. And there is no real law enforcement out there in terms of the Forest Service and the BLM. The levels of law enforcement officers have dropped dramatically over the past decade, down, I think, I was looking at some statistics, and it's as much as 20% over even just a 5-year period. And so you have law enforcement officers, the only ones who are allowed to carry a gun, mind you, in the Forest Service and the BLM, and they have about 1 million acres to protect, not including all the Forest Service employees that happen to be out there, or the handful of Forest Service employees that are out there. So you basically have an unprotected population of people who are trying to do the nation's request, the nation's good, and take care of our land, water, and animals for this and future generations, who are getting beat to crap. So it matters.
Yes, I appreciate your passion, your bluntness, to use your word, your candor. And I think that, I hope that the folks listening understand the emotional strain, the real cost of being a frontline federal agency employee. Just a quick offering here. One of the things I do anytime I meet, and I didn't do this when I was younger, but I offer my gratitude anytime I meet with a federal agency employee. And I say, my gratitude doesn't change the fact that I might be here to talk with you about something that I think you should be doing better, and some criticism in that. But I really feel like it's important, and I've come to realize this as I've gotten older, that we recognize the strain, the cost, and really the heroic journey that all federal employees, at least for the land management agencies, engage in by doing this work. So I want to offer my gratitude. I actually have a question that I hadn't, it's in our mix of questions, but I wasn't sure that I was going to ask it. But why do you suppose, to both of you, the West is an incubating ground for insurrection and groups that want to challenge the authority of the federal government? And I'll make my question a little more leading. When you're one law enforcement person and you've got 1 million acres to protect, how do you do that job in rural communities where the sheriff and the local law enforcement might be embedded in the culture and hostile to the role of the federal government? What are your thoughts on that, Richard, first, as it relates to how the West is an incubating ground for insurrection and extremism?
Well, frankly, in terms of the region I worked in and live in, I think a lot of it has to do, and I think Betsy Quammen 3 weeks ago on your previous webinar has really researched this and documented in one of her recent books, is the Mormon culture. This part of southern Utah, Arizona Strip, Arizona, southern Nevada has a strong Mormon historic influence. And I jokingly maybe call them the Mormon Mafia. But basically I saw a lot of sort of incestuous connections at BLM, where you would have the range team lead as the Mormon bishop, and that many in his ward were the ranching permittees that he was supposed to be working with at arm's length in terms of range management on BLM lands. Heard of nepotism with a range con who had a cousin who was one of the permittees under his charge. Another cousin of Cliven Bundy worked on the district staff. So you start to see, and I think it's probably somewhat common in the more rural offices, these interconnections, this interwoven local culture, local politics, local influence, how it greatly affects how consistently or reliably the federal laws are being implemented out on the ground, the reality, whether it's the Endangered Species Act, Antiquities Act, whatever.
Yeah.
And BLM spends millions on resource management planning, but often a lot of those decisions aren't being implemented. So you kind of wonder, okay, isn't that just a giant waste of the public's time and the public's money if these lofty decisions are basically being ignored in reality and are not being implemented?
Yeah.
I'm glad I didn't have to do law enforcement out on the ground, because I'd probably be dead now if I did, because I tend to speak truth to power, and that's not a good career choice in a federal land management agency. So I'm still alive, though I do have BLM PTSD, and that's probably a lifelong condition. But so, John, I think a lot of it here is the White Jews movement, as Gloria pointed out, Reagan and James Watt, going back to those days, and then carried forward primarily through Republican administrations, but where you see law enforcement infiltrated by supporters of these lawbreakers, and land managers who are either afraid of them or basically agree with them.
Yeah.
So people really need to wake up to this if they care about public lands and environmental compliance. It's not just on the books. It's not just action alerts to Congress.
Yep.
It's start to deal more with the reality out on the ground.
Yep.
Thanks.
I'd like to hear from you, Gloria, but let me just note 3 things. First of all, the chat box has some questions. I'll get to one of those in a moment. Second of all, if you're wondering what you can do about this, know that we have an action alert targeting or actually soliciting the support of both hopefully Interior Secretary, soon to be confirmed Deb Haaland, and the Chief of the Forest Service to address threats and intimidation and harassment. And the second thing is, in a moment after we hear from Gloria, we're going to shift the conversation to what needs to be done. So I want people to know, especially because I've seen some questions along those lines. But first, your perspective, Gloria, on the question of how the West is sort of an incubating ground for this.
Well, the mythos of the West, and I use that not in a pejorative way at all, because I love it, I live it, I'm part of it. Independence, wide open spaces, freedom, all those things that come to mind as characteristics and values that come to mind when you think of the West are really truly alive and well and are very valued by Westerners. And so when you have the perception that you are being regulated, controlled, forced to do something differently than, say, your grandfather did, then they tend to resist, get your hackles up. I don't like this. I don't like this infringement. And I think where I see a lot of this story embedded and embodied is in the ranching community. Ranchers have been on the land in some cases for 3-4 generations, not a long time in the course of our global history, but for a long time here. And so they like to keep doing things the way things have been done. And an example I like to use is that my grandfather used to deliver ice in a horse-drawn carriage in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Well, if I were still in my grandfather's business, I'd be selling stainless steel side-by-side Frigidaires online. that's how significant the amount of change that has happened in society. When we compare that then to the ranching community, and granted it is a different, different elements, et cetera. When we compare that to the ranching business, there hasn't been nearly as much change or a desire for that same kind of change. However, that's what it looks like on the surface. But when you dig deeper and you look at the consolidation in the meatpacking industry, the combination of climate change, of environmental regulation because of severe overgrazing, then suddenly it feels like, oh my God, there's a whole lot of regulations. They're coming down on me hard. And then you have, as Richard wisely pointed out, in the Reagan administration, there was an attempt, and a very successful attempt, to drive a wedge between economy and environment, and saying that environmentalists want your job. That resonated deeply, and we can see that in the Northwest Forest Plan dealing with spotted owls. We can see it repeated over and over again, that it's the environmentalists who are coming after you. So let's brush NAFTA under the carpet. Let's brush the consolidation in the meatpacking industry. Let's brush the changing dietary desires of a consumer to low-fat, better, more humane treatment, no pesticide, no herbicide, no vaccine, vitamins, etc., vaccines. And those are the factors that are changing the ranching community, or the ranching business. But what's happening is that it's far easier to say, there's an environmentalist, I see her, and there's a Forest Service guy, I see him in his green uniform, and they are conspiring against me. And so suddenly you've made this very personal and very local, and it feels very real. Then you can talk about NAFTA and the economy and diet change and all that all you want, but those are too complex of answers when I can just point to an environmentalist and point to a Forest Service or BLM person and say, they are damaging me, they are coming after me, they don't like me, they want me to go away, they want me to starve. And then it goes all the way to bizarre politicians that say that there's a rural genocide happening, that the Western way of life is trying to be extirpated and everybody forced to be in cities, and the federal government's going to take over your land. And those kind of conspiracy theories then take off, and you can't really walk those back or unwind them once people get wound up and find it as a simple reason for their pain. Yeah. And people want a simple reason for their pain. They don't want to deal with complexities.
Yeah, part of what I hear you saying is you have a cultural group that is deeply resistant to change in a world that is rapidly changing. I want to get to one question and then pivot the conversation. And it's relevant. What is and maybe it's for you, Richard, what is the origin of grazing rights and ranchers determining they have a God-given right to use our public lands for private purposes? Can you offer a 30-second response to that so that we can then pivot and get to what needs to be done to remedy these problems?
Well, John, I think we've talked about some of what I would call the sense of privilege or entitlement that's culturally based. It goes back a long time. In terms of, and then there's the history of BLM, which is maybe boring, but back in the 20s and 30s, when there was severe overgrazing, about the time of World War I, that you had the General Grazing Service, the General Land Office, and a hodgepodge of weird public land laws. And it wasn't really until 1976 when Congress passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA, which is now the new organic law, but the organic law for BLM, that you finally had some, potentially more consistent management. And a lot of people always say that BLM is a multiple use agency, but they often forget the other side of the same coin, which is that FLPMA said BLM is to manage for sustained yield. So really it's multiple use with sustained yield, and sustained yield means that you're not diminishing the productivity of the land and the resources to serve future generations. So there's kind of a long history. That's kind of a tough question. But again, to me, it just goes back to the cultural issue of that feeling of, and Bundy has said this, he doesn't acknowledge the federal government owning the lands that all of his trespass cows have been on for over a quarter of a century. He just it's like flat earth or something. It's like basically the federal government doesn't exist in Clark County, Nevada, and he would prefer that state, or ideally the county sheriffs, would be the only ones that have any authority, and they tend to be his friends and wouldn't touch his trespass anyway.
Yeah.
But a lot of this stuff is to me, the touchstone is the cultural attitudes and the upbringing, this feeling that I don't have to change, you can't make me change. And clearly, if you don't try to make me change, it just emboldens me to do more. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are multiple cultural problems to this, the culture of the agencies, the culture of the communities. I want to jump to what do we do about this? And riffing off the culture theme, you've talked, Richard, about cultural rot within the BLM. I know that our audience wants to hear what can be done about this. What are some specific things that can be done to remedy the cultural rot? And I just want to add to this. We talked about this the other day. If you're a BLM agency official in DC who just gets appointed, there's a lot of attraction to the shiny object. Let's designate a new national monument, and not a whole lot of attention to ensuring that monuments and laws and other things are actually fulfilling the promise of their designations and the aspirations in them as well. The only way you get to that is through hard culture work. So what do you think needs to be done?
John, it may seem like kind of a weird analogy, but they say in real estate, the three key things are location, location, location. In terms of our conversation about public lands and culture and insurrection, I think the three key terms are accountability, accountability, accountability.
Mm-hmm.
We need the Department of Justice and hopefully Merrick Garland as the new AG, the FBI, other law enforcement agencies to finally belatedly start effectively doing their job at arresting and prosecuting obvious lawbreakers that are making threats on federal employees and that are violating other laws and violating court orders, whether through bench warrants for contempt of court orders, whether through civil liens on property because of what's owed the taxpayers, whether more targeted, stealthy roundups instead of massive ones with advanced publicity. There's lots of methods that I've recommended for years that have been ignored where law enforcement could have been far more effective. I filed a whistleblower complaint a year or two before the 2016 Bunkerville standoff. And if a lot of my recommendations hadn't been ignored, potentially the standoff could have been averted. Without the standoff, we might not have had the Malheur refugee occupation in Oregon. And without that, we might not have had the Proud Boys et al., sovereign citizens, January 6th, trying to stop the electoral vote count in Congress. All these things, to me, are very closely connected. But that's the external. The internal rot in the agencies will be equally challenging for the Biden administration. But the bottom line is to hold managers accountable. They need to have their performance evaluations based on land health and how they solve problems, not how they avoid solving problems. There's a lot of well-paid managers that have career security by not doing their jobs. That's wrong.
Yeah.
That's stealing from the American people, in my opinion. If you can't do your job, leave. Let somebody else come in who might have the guts or the competence to do it better, or to do it. I think there should be independent audits of decisions. Think about it, as taxpayers, we know there's always a potential of an IRS audit of our taxes. So if we do anything funny with our taxes, we might get caught. Well, how about if BLM managers are subject to routine audits of some of their management decisions to see if they violated the law, ignored the best science, or there was some conflicts of interest or corruption involved? Again, obvious things. Continuing education. We have a lot of managers who graduated 30 or 40 years ago with a bachelor's degree in range science that aren't up to date on not only the latest laws and regulations and policies, they're not even up to date on a lot of this emerging science dealing with range management, including with respect to climate change and biodiversity protection.
Yeah.
So there's obvious things: improved performance evaluations, independent audits, continuing education. And I also learned the hard way, the whistleblower process is badly broken. And that's supposed to be an escape valve for employees. They get annual training on whistleblower, and I saw it was largely an illusion. There's also record keeping training, but a lot of managers will advise staff, don't put anything embarrassing in writing. That's fraud. When you tell employees to not do things that their annual training tells them they're supposed to do, that's corruption.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard, for I mean, there's a lot of that's both heartening if the Biden administration were to heed what you offered, but then there's also some real disheartening reality there, that you've got an agency that is quite dysfunctional. I'd like to hear your perspectives on this, Gloria. I know you've talked both about the differences within the Forest Service, and also you offered, just a reflection about some of what is going on is the disorienting rate of change. I wonder how do groups like Guardians, how do the agencies and others both say, we're not going to tolerate essentially bullies, and we're going to recognize how we manage this whole rate of change better? That's a leading question. If you also wanted to reflect on some of what Richard spoke to, please do that as well.
I will, thank you. Yes, I think Richard had a number of really good solutions. The accountability based on environmental quality by managers, land managers. I would also add that also based on true feedback from their employees, because they're subordinates, their employees are usually in the best position to see, indeed, whether that whether that accountability is being maintained. And I would also suggest that leadership in land management agencies really needs to be kinder, more compassionate towards their employees as well as towards the public they serve. I think Forest Service and BLM gets black eyes, and sometimes well-deserved, for treating people poorly, for treating people with disrespect. Not that I'm saying that everybody has earned that respect, but your first encounter should not be rattling your saber and quoting a regulation. You have to understand where people are coming from and what people understand. That's a way to another solution that I'd like to offer, and that is public support. I'm not saying to, as you pointed out, John, I'm not saying that means don't disagree or, look the other way when something is done incorrectly on public lands. But when something is done correctly, how about some kudos? How about some, hey, good, that's what we want to see. You wouldn't believe the impact and effect that has on a person, a person who happens to be a federal land management agent, or an employee. If someone actually says, hey, you did a good job, wow, that's exciting. That's reinforcing. When I made the decision to put a moratorium on drilling on the Rocky Mountain front, I got and this was before we had a lot of email use, I got over 100 letters. I was sent flowers. people sent me pictures of their grandchildren, and it still chokes me up today, to remember that. That was moving. That gave me such incredible courage and conviction to keep doing what I was doing, regardless of what the threats were, because I knew I was doing the right thing. I heard from people, the people that I was serving. So that public support is really a huge component. And it doesn't have to be, send a flowers or send cards, but how about talking to your neighbor that's trashing the BLM for, restricting or making them abide by their grazing permit? Don't sit there, nod your head and go, yeah, those guys suck. How about, what's the condition of your land look like? Challenge the people. They think if they have public support, they're going to act up even more. And I also really like the idea of the independent audit. I've been on the board of an organization called Earthworks for about 20-some years. And one of the things that we did was an independent audit of, did mining activities actually meet what they said they were going to do, or did the effects match what the effects were claimed to be in the environmental impact statements that permitted them to go forward? 90% of the time, the answer is no, and a big, nasty no, particularly when you're dealing with hydrology. So these independent audits really can inform us of how well our public lands are being treated if we just match up, are the effects what they were projected to be, and if not, why not, and what are we going to do about that next time, and use those as precedents for the next time we're looking at the possibility of such a project.
I love that theme of accountability, because it just is really resonant. I also, just reflecting as I'm listening to you, like recognizing the humanity in federal agencies, and really being kinder, being more compassionate, expressing our gratitude. I've been reflecting on this at Guardians, that if those are core values, and I like to think they are for us, then we need to ensure that those core values show up in all of our interactions. And we have a gap between the ideal and the aspiration and where we are today. So I appreciate those reflections as well. I'd like to fulfill my promise to get to some questions. Sort of rapid fire, either one of you could take these. Is the Biden administration aware of this problem? President Biden should put his foot down and order these complicit local law enforcement characters are put in their place or replaced with people who will work with the government to do what's right. So briefly, just so we can get to 3 or 4 more questions, what are your senses, each of you, of whether or not the Biden administration is aware of this bigger problem?
I think they're well aware, and it's reflected in so many different areas, not just land management or public land management, but definitely when you have law enforcement who are reinforcing and condoning the law breaking, there's a problem, and those people need to be in a different job.
Richard, briefly.
Yeah, John, I think in a weird way, and this may sound a little perverse, that the January 6th attack on the Capitol might have finally been the overreach that will finally wake up the Justice Department, the FBI, other law enforcement, and obviously the new Biden administration on the serious threat posed by domestic terrorism. It also points out the obvious, really pathetic racial divide, that if that insurrection, riot, whatever, had been people of color or Middle Eastern origin, everyone knows it would have been handled a lot differently, and the response would have been a lot more prompt and strong. And you still wouldn't have a lot of Republicans trying to downplay or give cover to what happened, to those who caused the riot. So I'm sort of guardedly optimistic that even though I felt the Obama administration totally dropped the ball on these issues for its 8 years, that the Biden administration will wake up to that. And by the way, I was really pleased to see a couple days ago that Nada Culver, who's a friend and a very good person on BLM reform, was just nominated to be the new Pendley, the new Deputy Director of Policy and Programs at BLM.
Mhm.
And Nada has a real strong background in environmental law, public lands issues. She ran the BLM Action Center for the Wilderness Society, then she was VP for Audubon. So that to me is a very positive sign. And obviously I'm hoping that despite some GOP opposition that Deb Haaland will soon be confirmed and get going on her work.
Yeah. Here's another question, and then I'm going to throw one other quick one to each of you. How about a congressional hearing subcommittee or otherwise on the sovereign movements to bring attention, I think it's AKA, Frank Church, CIA, FBI, COINTELPRO, John Kerry, Contra's money for, it's a big question, but I think the main question is, congressional hearing, subcommittee hearing, like it's tactical, but what do you each think of that idea as a means of shining the spotlight?
I think it would be beneficial. I mean, I testified in front of a congressional subcommittee hearing that was trying to espouse that left-wing extreme environmentalists were the reason why there were issues and problems in the West. And yeah, there were a few issues of people doing violent and inappropriate things, but from the environmental side was minuscule compared to the right-wing side. But anyhow, I think that it's helpful because I don't think that the American public is that tuned into all the dimensions of this domestic terrorism, and I think that the domestic terrorism on public lands is a really big dimension that is not very well known. So, yeah, I'm in favor.
Yeah. What about you, Richard, quickly?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. And as I've indicated, I'd like Congress to investigate the external as well as the internal threats on employees trying to do their jobs. And the other thing I'd say respectfully, John, is in addition to maybe getting emails into the new Interior and Agriculture Department leadership, the Justice Department plays a huge role in this. Because a lot of these law enforcement cases, when they get to a certain level, they leave the hands of the land management agencies. And they're basically referred to the Justice Department. And it's the US attorneys that decide whether to get court orders, as they have in the Clive and Bundy thing that haven't been enforced, and Clive has not been held in contempt for those or jailed. So it's looking at that. Also, there was a previous trespass with a guy named Klump, the Klump family in Arizona, that BLM over several years successfully handed through putting Klump in jail and through civil forfeitures. And yet those tools haven't been tried for over a quarter century for Clive and Bundy.
Yeah.
And Congress needs to ask the law enforcement agencies, why not? Why haven't you used obvious tools that wouldn't potentially provoke violent or risk public safety? This low-hanging fruit, why haven't you picked it?
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally agree. Hearings would be great.
Yep. One more question from that for me. Briefly, hopes and fears for Deb Haaland, assuming, fingers crossed, that she gets confirmed by the Senate in terms of her role in addressing these issues. Richard first in less than 30 seconds, and then you, Gloria, and then I'm going to close.
I certainly wish Deb Haaland well. She's going to face monumental challenges. And she's obviously a historic, long overdue nomination. But my fear is if we don't see, as I was saying, the Justice Department starting to hold lawbreakers accountable, starting to deal with domestic terrorism in a comprehensive and effective way, that we're going to see a lot of these problems continue. Because again, all these things at the federal level are interwoven. If you don't have Justice Department people and the FBI effectively doing their jobs, it undermines what the land managers do. If the land managers are ignoring problems, it never gets elevated to where it becomes a law enforcement issue. So we need accountability, but we also need to recognize all those connections. Hopefully Deb Haaland will be on top of this, and hopefully she'll have very strong public support to do what's necessary.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Gloria, briefly, thoughts, hopes, fears for Deb Haaland.
Well, she'll have her hands full. You know, I think we pin so much on these good people getting in, and it is important, but they can't do it by themselves, and they're going to have just thousands of issues, literally, in front of them. And so we need to be as helpful as we can from the outside, and not just say, oh, well, Deb Haaland's in there, cool, everybody kick back, she's going to be great. No, we have to redouble our efforts and support her and her team, and not put everything on her and think, well, why can't she do this? And why? There's no magic wand, there's no silver bullet. And so we're all in this together, and we just breathe a sigh of relief because we don't have an infestation on the inside when we have people like Deb Haaland there.
Yep. Thank you, Gloria. That's a perfect segue to my close, which is just a plea to all of you who've joined us for today's discussion to continue to be courageous in your own ways and support federal agency decision makers when they make good decisions. Engage your elected officials to ask them to do more to investigate these problems, to create a culture of accountability. And so take the first step, sign our action alert. And thank you, Richard. Thank you, Gloria. This was really a great discussion, conversation. It's reflected in the gratitude that people are offering in the chat box right now, reflected in the questions as well. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but we're going to have another webinar next Wednesday on the issue of trapping. So if that interests you, please show up. And thank you again for the questions. And thank you, Richard and Gloria, for your time and wisdom and perspective.
Thanks, John.
Okay. Adios, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.